we have a pretty typical Colorado church. What that means is, and this is true across all of the other churches that I know in the area, what it means is on average, people are here 2, maybe at most 3 times on a month, which is okay. Like, it's totally and completely normal. I'm convinced that churches in the South only appear to be bigger. It's just because they have everyone in the same room at the same time. When people ask me how many people come to our church, I give them 2 numbers. I give them the number that's typically here on a Sunday, and then I give them the total number because people come in shifts. It's not a problem for me. We've accepted it long ago. I think when Kanan and I started things years and years ago, and there was like a dozen people showing up, we gave up any and all expectations of grandeur and any kind of like expectation that this would be a big thing. So we're cool with it. The only problem, the only drawback is that regularly when I'm talking with some of you have been around for a while, and I go, hey, have you met so-and-so yet? Most of the time I hear, no, I haven't met them yet. And that is so sad to me because the average level of coolness in this room is much higher than any other room that I'm ever in. You are amazing people. Truly, like the privilege that it is to lead a church packed to the gills with so many incredible people, I can't even tell you how great it is. I was on the phone with a pastor in Austin, Texas last week, and I spent probably too much time on the call gushing about how wonderful all of you are and what a gift it is to get to lead you and be a part of this with you. But it's sad to me that some of you don't know each other or you haven't connected with each other yet. So all I ask, keep skiing and camping and doing all the stuff you do on Sundays. I think that's awesome. All I ask is when you are here, try to meet somebody new or try to rekindle a connection that maybe kind of faded or fizzled for whatever reason. Because this church is packed with a ton of incredible people. And that goes for all of you, but it also goes for all of our leadership and our staff. There are people at sort of every level of leadership, volunteer staff, and otherwise that are just the tops. On Holy Week this year, Tim Thomas led and produced not only our Good Friday service, but also our Easter Sunday service, both of which had some pretty significant complications for somebody to technically produce. The only light controls for this room are back there in that corner where you can't see the room. And Trey was back there trying to run a Tenebrae service, which requires lights going up and down from the only part of the room where you can't see the room. And we have people show up time and time again, sometimes for an outdoor service, which is completely difficult to manage from a technical perspective. We have people in the back who are doing incredible work week in and week out. Kids, staff, amazing. We have some amazing people around here. And that goes all the way to our elder board. Last week, you got to hear from the president of our elder board, Carol Willis. She delivered a homily that was dubbed by one of our other elders as top 5 homilies ever at our church. And I listened to it, and I completely agree. It was beautiful and pertinent and timely and everything it needed to be. By my estimate, about 415 homilies have been preached in the existence of our church. And well over 100 of those were not by me, because we're doing everything we can to tap into the very deep bench that we have of people who have this gift to share with you. Something beautiful and amazing, and Carol did exactly that. And if you missed it, you can find it on our, I think, Spotify and elsewhere. It exists out there. It's out there. You'll find it. I believe in you. Last week, Carol talked about some of the doubt and despair that can come along with life and how Jesus meets us in that doubt and despair in his resurrected form. And today, although it will pale in comparison to what Carol did last week, I want to do the same, but I want to talk about disappointment. And I'm going to do so using a story called The Road to Emmaus, something you may be familiar with, something you maybe have heard before, or at least maybe you've heard that title, The Road to Emmaus. This is one of a handful of stories that we had that take place between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension. Remember, I said a couple of weeks ago that there are about 40 days between those two events. about 40 days, and what Jesus chose to do during that time is a particular fascination of mine, and therefore you have to also be fascinated by it because you have to listen to me. But also, I am fascinated deeply by what the gospel authors chose to include in their gospels. Clearly, there was a lot more that happened in those 40 days than was recorded, but the gospel authors chose a handful of stories. Why those stories? What do they mean? What do they have for us? That's something that I may spend the rest of my life pursuing and thinking about and considering. And so this morning, I'm going to read to you a story that takes place between two places. It's a story on the road. It's a story in transition. It's a story in between Jerusalem and Emmaus. I'm going to read this story to you. It's rather long compared to other stories that we typically read. And whatever you need to do to get into the story, do that. If it's close your eyes, if it's take some notes on things you're feeling or thinking, maybe think back to the grounding exercise that Davey took us through at the beginning of the service, whatever you need to do to kind of inject your senses into this story, please do that. It goes like this. That same day, two of them were walking to the village Emmaus, about 7 miles out of Jerusalem. They were deep in conversation, going over all these things that had happened. In the middle of their talk and questions, Jesus came up and walked along with them, but they were not able to recognize who he was. He asked, "What's this you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" They just stood there, long-faced, like they had lost their best friend. Then one of them, his name was Cleopas, said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who hasn't heard what's happened during the last few days?" He said, "What has happened?" They said, "The things that happened to Jesus, the Nazarene. He was a man of God, a prophet, dynamic in work and word, blessed by both God and all the people. Then our high priests and leaders betrayed him, got him sentenced to death and crucified him. And we had our hopes up that he was the one about to deliver Israel. And it is now the 3rd day since it happened. But now some of our women have completely confused us. Early this morning, they were at the tomb and couldn't find his body. They came back with the story that they had seen a vision of angels who had said that he was alive. Some of our friends went off to the tomb to check and found it empty, just as the women said, but they did not see Jesus." Then he said to them, "So thick-headed, so slow-hearted, why can't you simply believe all that the prophets have said? Don't you see that these things had to happen, that the Messiah had to suffer and only then enter into his glory?" Then he started at the beginning with the books of Moses and went on through the prophets, pointing out everything in the scriptures that referred to him. They came to the edge of the village where they were headed. He acted as if he was going on, but they pressed him, "Stay and have supper with us. It's nearly evening. The day is done." So he went in with them. And here's what happened. He sat down at the table with them. Taking the bread, he blessed and he broke and he gave it to them. And at that moment, open-eyed, wide-eyed, they recognized him. And then he disappeared. Back and forth they talked. Didn't we feel on fire as he conversed with us on the road, as he opened up the scriptures for us? They didn't waste a minute. They were up and on their way back to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their friends gathered together, talking away. It's really happened. The master has been raised up. Simon saw him. Then the two went over and everything that happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke the bread. There's something in this particular story that I noticed for the first time, or I noticed it again and I forgot that I had noticed it before, but I'm not sure which. Either way, I noticed something that I thought was particularly interesting in this particular story at the end of the Gospel of Luke. It mirrors, in a lot of ways, a story that takes place at the beginning of the Gospel as well. There's 2 stories that bookend Luke's Gospel. Not completely at the beginning and not completely at the end, but near the beginning and near the end. And both of them are post-Passover stories. Both of them are stories that take place right after Passover. In the first one, Jesus is a young boy, and Jesus is at the temple. He's at the temple with his family because it was tradition and custom at that time to travel to Jerusalem to go to the temple for the Passover meal. no matter where you lived. They lived in Galilee in a town called Nazareth, and they made a multi-day journey to get to Jerusalem to experience Passover every year. That was just a pilgrimage that they made. There wasn't any ifs, ands, or buts about it. They would just do it. It was a normal thing to do. And in that time, you would, along with the meal, you would spend some time in the temple, and you would listen, and you would learn, and you would ask questions, and you sometimes would have something to teach, and you would engage in debate, and you would engage in conversation about every element of life, not just spiritual, but every other part of life as well. This was a common practice. Well, it came time for Jesus' family to pack up and go home, and they do so. And as they pack up, it was a bit of a communal experience, a communal culture, and so everybody was sort of taking care of everybody else. And at some point, somebody probably did a bit of a head count, and there was a head count that took place, and maybe Jesus was wearing the same hat or maybe one of the neighbor kids was wearing the same hat that Jesus was wearing, and so when the head count took place, it looked like Jesus was with them, but he was in fact not. And not long later, a couple of days later, Mary gets off of an airplane and goes, "Jesus," and realizes that she left Jesus home alone. They go back days later, and they find Jesus, and he's totally fine. At some point, he strapped on his BB gun, and he said, "This is my house. I have to defend it." The plot lines of this story and Home Alone are almost the same, and I'm not kidding. If you read it again, and you should, they're almost the same. So Jesus is there, and he's totally fine, and he's doing three things. He's listening, he's asking questions, and he's teaching. And the people there are blown away because he's a kid. His understanding of the scriptures and humanity and God is just mind-blowing to them. He's listening, he's asking questions, and he's teaching. And then we fast forward to the end of the gospel, and Luke tells another post-Passover story. But this time, the main difference, the thing that draws my attention because it's so different from the first, is the venue is completely different. The venue is in between. It's not a particular place. There's no address. It's just along the road. The venue doesn't have a particular confining fence or gate or wall or anything around it to indicate where it is. It's difficult to pin down. They're on the way. They're walking and they're talking. They're doing two of the most ordinary things that you will do today, you'll do tomorrow, and you'll do the next day. And Jesus shows up, and he does the same three things. He listens, he asks questions, and he teaches. He shows up in a moment where they are at their most vulnerable. He shows up in a moment not in a way that they can recognize, and therefore they aren't masking in any way. They're not pretending to be anything that they're not actually. They're not posturing in some way because it's Jesus. We better put on our best face. We better act a certain way. They're in their most vulnerable state, and Jesus enters into that space, and he listens, and he asks questions, and he teaches. And there's, at some point in their dialogue, in their conversation, there's this line. It's not even the full sentence. It's just the first part. And in other translations, which I didn't love the way that they did the actual full narrative, and so I didn't choose it. But in other translations, it says, "We had hoped." We had hoped. We were so hopeful that Jesus was the one. We were so hopeful that he was actually who he said he was. We were so hopeful that this was all going to work out the way that we thought it was going to work out. We had an idea of where it was going to go, and we were so hopeful it was going to get there, and it didn't get there. And Jesus meets them in that disappointment in a way that they never expected, in a place that they never expected, and in a form and with words that they never saw coming. The way that Jesus meets us in our disappointment is rarely the way that we had hoped. You have all, at some point in time in your life, maybe today, said, I had hoped that my job would be different than it is. I had hoped that my child would not have received that diagnosis. I had hoped that my mental health would be different than it is. I had hoped that my neighborhood would be safer than it is. I had hoped that by this stage in life I would have experienced this or accomplished that. I had hoped that my adult children and I would have had a better relationship than we do. I had hoped, we had hoped. We have all experienced disappointment in life, and the way that Jesus shows up and meets them in their disappointment is remarkable, doing the same thing that he had always done, but now the venue is completely different. And in some way meets them in their most vulnerable, and their most real, and their most raw experience. During Holy Week, we have a tradition as a family of hosting a Maundy Thursday service in our home. And so many of you attend these services in other people's homes, sometimes in our home. It's a really simple service where we kind of reenact parts of the Passover experience. Really just, we reinstate communion together and we wash each other's feet. It's a really simple experience. And it's one of my favorites of the year. It's one of the things that I look forward to the most. It's one of the things that I think about a lot. And it's also coming during Holy Week, which requires a tremendous amount of other work and organizing and planning from me and our staff. So it's this thing that I love, but it's followed by Good Friday, and it's followed by Easter Sunday, and there's so much planning and preparation around it, and I feel pretty overwhelmed, and I feel pretty overloaded, and I usually show up to Maundy Thursday in a pretty vulnerable state. Emotionally, relationally, spiritually, mentally, vocationally, every one of those, I'm pretty frazzled and fried. But that's one of the things that's made it consistently one of the most special experiences that I've had as a part of this church. And so this last year was no different, except for the fact that our kids were in a very particular state that evening. Our kids, as many of you know, come from a variety of different backgrounds, and most of them have experienced trauma that can flare up at times and really derail sort of everything. And that is our gift in life to manage and to steward. And it is also very difficult. The absolute war zone that Julie has dealt with and managed prior to being here on a Sunday morning is pretty gut-wrenching. Or at any of the gatherings that we have. And you know what that's like because you've experienced some of this too. Whether it's one of your kids or your own personal stuff that's going on in your own mind, maybe depression or anxiety, something is going on in your life where you know what it's like to barely be able to make it in the door. That is often our experience on a Sunday, on a Thursday, whatever it is. Makes it very hard for us to host things in our home. It makes it very hard for us to be a part of a group. So as much as I'm like, table groups, they're awesome. Everyone should be a part of one. Really very hard for our family to be a part of something like that. This particular Maundy Thursday, I got home, was ready for the experience, but feeling pretty frazzled, and things were in bad shape at home. And it wasn't anybody's fault. No one had done anything wrong. It was just my kids had picked that day. And I took that immediately personally because I'm like, this is my day. This is like the thing I look forward to, and I don't have what it takes to handle this right now. And Julie, in her grace, absorbed pretty much every single blow that evening, which was exhausting for her. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, this is an awful Maundy Thursday experience. This isn't good for anybody. The handful of people that are at our house right now are probably having a miserable time. I know I'm miserable. I'm never doing this again. That's all I'm thinking. Like, we're never hosting Maundy Thursday at our house again. This is just impossible for us. And by the way, even after the story I'm about to tell, I'm still not sure. Like, verdict's out on that. I don't know yet. Because it was really rough, and I won't forget it. And we finished up, and we'd done the foot washing, and we had done the communion, and we got our kids up to bed, and things got even worse upstairs. And then we came down, and the group that was over at our house was still there, and they were talking, and they were having a wonderful conversation. And I didn't even feel like I could even engage it because I was so just emotionally trashed. And I get some texts later on from that group. That was a great night. It was beautiful, the way that God met us in that space. And I'm like blown away. Because I'm like, how could that be? How could you have had a good experience? And I texted them a couple days later, and I just said, I'm sorry if there was any distraction. I had a hard time that night, but I'm so glad that Jesus showed up for you. I was deeply disappointed. I was deeply disappointed in how that experience went. It wasn't what I had hoped. It wasn't what I wanted, and it wasn't what I needed. And then I remembered that there was this one moment. There was this moment on Maundy Thursday at our house when we were doing the foot washing. And when we do the foot washing, we tried to extend a blessing to the person whose feet we're washing. Some sort of a gift of words, even if it's just, may God bless you, period. A gift of words to the person whose feet are being washed. And I had asked one of my kids who is having the worst time. And when this particular child is triggered and having a really tough time, they lose a lot of their vocabulary, like 99% of the vocabulary. And they can't really say a lot. But I had asked them, hoping that somehow the texture of the water or the change in temperature, that can go either way, right? That could be a trigger in the wrong direction, or it could help things snap back in place. But things were already pretty bad, so I was like, let's pull the pin out of the grenade and have a great time. Let's see what happens, right? So I was like, let's just see if this helps, you know? And I say, I'd love for you to wash my feet. Would you do that? And they kneel down, and I put my feet in the water. And they wash my feet, and one of my other kids remembers the blessing part and says, hey, you're supposed to do a blessing for Dad. And like I said, this child of mine is completely triggered, has almost no vocabulary, has regressed emotionally by half their age. And they look up at me and they say, because I can't think of anything else, Wakanda forever. And it was simultaneously the funniest thing and the most meaningful thing that I have ever experienced, because I know that was code for I love you. Like, I know that that's what they meant. Like, I love you and I'm here, you know? And I'll never forget that experience. And in a way, it felt like in my deep disappointment, in my incredible frustration, in my fatigue, and in my sense that everything was going wrong for everybody, Jesus shows up in the most unexpected person, one of my kids, at the most unexpected time when I'm frazzled and frustrated and I don't feel like God is close. And with the most unexpected words, like Wakanda forever, for my soul to grow and my heart to grow and for me to experience the love of God in the purest and most unexpected way that I ever have in my life. God meets us in those we had hoped moments in ways that we didn't expect most of the time. You probably have a preferred way that you would like for God to interact with your life. And it is rare that Jesus shows up in those moments, in those ways. And although that is deeply frustrating, it is also the unique way that God has chosen to interact with humanity. And so my hope for you is that when you have those we had hoped moments, I had hoped moments, that you will look for God in ways that you didn't expect, at times that you didn't expect, in locations that you didn't expect. Because God is around you and God is with you and God is for you, even when it doesn't feel like it. I'm going to leave you with this blessing, this prayer that St. Patrick wrote a long time ago that I hope you can use for your morning routine, your midday routine, your evening, whatever it is. Like, I hope that this is something that can be a gift for you in those we had hoped moments. It goes like this. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Let's pray. God, thank you for being with us and around us and in us, above us, beneath us, in every way connected to us. I am personally often frustrated and disappointed that you aren't doing things the way that I want you to do them. And I think that is a universally true thing about humans. And so, God, would you give us eyes to see and ears to hear where you are at work? Would you speak the words, I love you, to us in the ways that we desperately need to hear it, and at the times we need to hear it, and in the places we need to hear it. We love you, God, and we pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.